June the 6th, 1944 had been marked on calendars across the Allied world as the day everything would begin to change. The invasion of Normandy, D-Day, was not simply a military operation, but a turning point that millions hoped would eventually bring an end to years of suffering. And in the opening hours, the landing succeeded at a cost, with beaches finally secured through courage, sacrifice, and relentless determination. But victory on the sand was only the beginning. What came after, just a few miles inland, was something almost no planner fully anticipated. Normandy was supposed to be the gateway to France. Allied intelligence expected rapid mechanized advances pushing 30 miles inland within days, roads opening toward Paris, and an unstoppable momentum breaking the spine of German defenses. Instead, the promise of swift progress dissolved almost immediately into the thick, maze-like terrain of the Norman countryside. The enemy wasn't hidden in vast armored divisions or overwhelming artillery barrages. The real threat lay in something deceptively simple: hedgerows. To someone unfamiliar with the region, the word hedgerow might sound harmless, even quaint. But these were no home garden hedges. Norman hedgerows were ancient earthworks, living fortifications created over hundreds of years by farmers shaping their land. They were thick, intertwined barriers of rock, soil, roots, and vegetation, forming natural walls, sometimes 15 feet high, with roots digging 10 feet deep. They divided the land into countless small fields, each with its own towering natural boundary. From above, Normandy looked like a patchwork quilt of walled-in boxes. On the ground, it felt like fighting inside a labyrinth. For infantry, these hedgerows created blind corners at every turn. For tanks, they created death traps. The American Sherman tank was reliable and versatile, but it was not designed to climb vertical earthen walls. When forced to do so, the tank pitched upward, exposing its underside, the thinnest and most vulnerable armor on the entire vehicle. German soldiers learned quickly to wait on the far side of a hedgerow, hidden from sight, armed with Panzerfausts or anti-tank rifles. The moment the Sherman's belly appeared over the crest, they fired. One well-placed shot was often all it took to ignite fuel, ammunition, and everything inside. Day after day, Allied tankers attempted to advance, and day after day, the results were the same. Shermans burning, crews lost, medics overwhelmed, and units stuck in the same choke points with no safe way forward. The hedgerows had turned the countryside into thousands of miniature fortresses. Every field became its own battlefield, every hedgerow a new enemy line. For the Allies, momentum died. For the Germans, it was an opportunity to bleed the invasion force dry without needing large numbers of reinforcements. Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron watched this disaster unfold repeatedly. He wasn't a strategist or commander, he was a mechanic by trade, a man who understood how machines behaved, what they could endure, and how they failed. And every time he saw another Sherman tilt upward, expose its soft underbelly, and erupt in flames, he felt a growing sense of frustration and disbelief. The problem was painfully obvious, yet no one seemed to have a solution. Tank crews he knew personally were being killed. He saw traumatized survivors dragging themselves out of burning hulls. He smelled the smoke of engines and ammunition cooking off. He saw medics working until exhaustion and morgue details clearing bodies daily. And he understood something that many strategists observing from afar didn't. This problem wasn't just slowing the war, it was threatening the entire invasion. To Culin, the question wasn't whether the problem was serious. It was whether the army could afford not to solve it. The Americans had numbers, courage, and air power. The Germans had terrain. And in those early days after D-Day, terrain was winning. It was here, amid frustration, exhaustion, and the grim knowledge that every failed crossing meant more death, that a thought began forming in Culin's mind. It wasn't polished, it wasn't scientific, It wasn't born from textbooks or engineering degrees. It was a simple observation from a man who knew how machines behaved when pushed the wrong way. Maybe the problem wasn't the hedgerows. Maybe the problem was the way tanks tried to go over them. And maybe, just maybe, there was another way through. The first spark of an idea often arrives quietly, without fanfare, without the dramatic weight of revelation. For Sergeant Curtis Culin, it began with a simple moment of observation repeated dozens of times. A Sherman tank climbing a hedgerow, its nose rising, its belly lifting, its vulnerable underside exposed, and then the sudden flash of impact as a German Panzerfaust or shell penetrated the thin armor. Smoke, fire, shouts, and silence always followed. Over and over again, the same tragedy. Culin was not an engineer. He was not a graduate of any military academy. He had no architectural blueprints or mathematical formulas. What he did have, however, was experience, years of working with vehicles, engines, and stubborn machinery in a small New Jersey garage. He understood leverage. He understood how steel behaved under force. He understood torque, balance, weight distribution. Most importantly, he understood that no machine, no matter how massive, behaved well when forced into a position it was never designed for. And watching yet another Sherman flare into a fireball, he suddenly saw the problem differently. Tanks were trying to climb hedgerows that were never meant to be climbed. The angle made them vulnerable. The height made them helpless. But what if they didn't climb at all? What if instead of going over, a tank could force its way straight through the base? The idea seemed absurd the moment it entered his mind. Hedgerows were not simple bushes. They were ancient earthen walls, packed tight with stone, roots, and centuries of compacted soil. Tearing through one would require immense force, but force wasn't the issue. Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons. They had more than enough weight for the job. What they lacked was a way to apply that force correctly. Culin began to sketch in his notebook, the same small book he always carried, filled with rough observations, ideas, and simple diagrams. At first, his crewmates teased him the way they always did. "Cullin's trying to solve the whole war with his little doodles," they joked. But beneath the teasing was a genuine skepticism. Countless intelligent officers, engineers, and planners had studied the hedgerow problem. None had beaten it. Why would an enlisted mechanic think he could do any better? But Culin understood something they didn't. Many brilliant thinkers approached problems from the top down, starting with complex solutions or large-scale theories. Mechanics like him approached problems differently. They looked at what they could do with what they had. They saw problems the way machines did, where stress appeared, where force failed, and how to redirect that force to get the result they needed. He noticed that the real issue wasn't the hedgerow itself, but the tank's angle of approach. If a tank could hit the base directly, without lifting its nose, it would never expose its belly. And if something sharp and strong could cut into the hedge and tear it apart, the tank's mass could do the rest. He realized that what he needed wasn't a complex engineering solution. It was simply a tool, steel prongs strong enough to bite into the hedge before the tank made contact. While thinking through materials, Culin remembered the beaches after D-Day. Scattered everywhere were steel constructions known as Czech hedgehogs, heavy anti-tank obstacles designed by the Germans to stop Allied landing craft. The irony struck him immediately. The Germans had placed thousands of these obstacles on the beaches, and now, in a twist of fate, those very obstacles might become the key to breaking their inland defences. The steel beams were thick, tough, and already shaped for strength. If cut down, sharpened, and welded to the front of a tank at the correct angle, they might act like giant knives, digging in at the hedge's base, slicing through roots and dragging the tank forward. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't refined, it wasn't pretty, but it was possible. And sometimes in war, possible was all that mattered. With his sketches in hand and his idea starting to bloom into something real, Culin faced the next challenge, convincing his commanding officer. Captain Samuel Morrison was a cautious, calculated man, responsible for the lives of everyone under him. He had heard countless harebrained schemes from desperate soldiers, but he had also seen enough Shermans burn to know that they needed a miracle. Approaching Morrison with the idea, Culin laid it out plainly. No theatrics, no false bravado, just logic, observation, and necessity. When Morrison stared at him, baffled, and repeated the idea back, "You want to weld scrap metal to a damaged tank and drive it full speed into a wall of earth?" Culin simply answered, "Sir, the current method is getting our men killed. My method keeps our armor facing the enemy. If they can't see the belly, they can't kill us." The captain looked at him for a long moment. Then he made the decision that would change everything. "You have 48 hours. The moment Captain Morrison gave his approval, a quiet shift happened inside Sergeant Culin. The idea was no longer a sketch in a notebook or a whispered theory among mechanics. It had become a mission. And in war, a mission meant responsibility, lives depending on whether you delivered or failed. The next 48 hours would test not just his idea, but his confidence, his skill, and the trust of every man who would ride in a modified Sherman tank. Culin gathered a small team of welders, mechanics, and volunteers from his squadron. None of them fully understood what he intended to build, but they trusted him enough to follow his lead. They walked together toward the beaches where the remnants of D-Day still lay scattered across the sand. German steel obstacles, Czech hedgehogs, stood twisted or intact. Remnants of defences overridden by the tide of invasion. To most soldiers, they were scrap. To Culin, they were raw material. He studied one closely, running his hand across the rough edges, testing its weight, noting the thickness. These massive X-shaped anti-tank barricades were made from heavy steel beams welded in a way that resisted force from any direction. It was exactly the kind of durable, battle-tested metal he needed. If anything could withstand the impact of a 30-ton tank slamming into a wall of earth, it would be this. With torches lit, his crew went to work. Sparks showered across the sand as they sliced through the beams. The sound of cutting steel mingled with the distant rumble of artillery somewhere inland. Time didn't pause for innovation. Every hour they worked, men at the front were fighting and dying because tanks couldn't break through hedgerows. That urgency pushed them through exhaustion. Piece by piece, they cut the beams down to size, forming long prongs that could be welded to the Sherman's front. They sharpened the ends to help them bite into the hedgerow. They filed and ground the edges with meticulous care. At night, lanterns flickered as they continued working under the dim glow, the sound of welding echoing across the quiet beach. When the prongs were ready, the next challenge loomed, attaching them to a tank without damaging the tank's frame or interfering with mobility. The Sherman they used had been hit earlier in the campaign, damaged but still mobile, a perfect candidate for experimentation. Culin crawled beneath it, examined its frontal armor, and marked the points where the steel beams would be attached. Angle mattered, position mattered. If the prongs sat too high, the tank would still tilt upward. Too low, and it would merely push dirt instead of cutting roots. After hours of trial, error, and recalculation, he settled on a downward angle of about 15 degrees, enough to dig into the base of the hedgerow without lifting the tank. They welded each prong carefully. Thick layers of molten steel fused back and forth across the seams until they were confident nothing would snap under impact. Sweat dripped into their collars as they worked in the heat radiating from the torch. Men rotated positions so no one grew too fatigued to weld safely. By dawn of the second day, the tank began to take on a strange new form. Standing back, soldiers gathered around, curious. Some laughed, calling it a porcupine tank or Culin's metal-ploughed monstrosity. Others eyed it with a mixture of amusement and hope. There was something undeniably intimidating about the four massive steel tusks protruding from the tank's front, an improvised beast built not for elegance but for brute force. Culin didn't mind the jokes. He knew soldiers joked about things they didn't understand or things they were afraid might fail. What mattered was whether it worked, not whether it looked strange. Captain Morrison arrived as the welders applied the finishing touches. He circled the tank slowly, running his hand along the newly added prongs, testing the welds and examining the angles. When he finished his inspection, he stood back and let out a slow breath. The tank was no longer just a machine. It was an idea made real. "All right, Sergeant," Morrison said. "You built your contraption. Now we see if it works." A small crowd of soldiers formed, drawn by curiosity and the hope that something, anything, might finally break the stalemate that had trapped them for days. Some placed quiet bets on whether the tank would punch through the hedge or tear itself apart. Others simply watched in silence. Culin felt exhaustion creeping in, but it was masked by a deeper anxiety. If the test failed, soldiers might die because of his miscalculation. If it succeeded, he might have just helped change the course of the campaign. The weight of that thought settled heavily on his shoulders. The test was scheduled for the next morning. That night, as Culin lay awake in his cot, he mentally replayed every weld, every angle, every measurement. He reminded himself of every observation he made about Sherman's climbing hedgerows. He recalculated forces, stress points, and the behavior of metal under impact. He barely slept. But when dawn approached, there was nothing left to adjust. The first hedgerow cutter in history, improvised, welded, and built under battlefield pressure, was ready. Now the only question left was simple. Would it work? Dawn crept slowly over the Norman countryside, its pale light revealing a landscape still scarred from the violence of D-Day. The air was damp, and the sky hung low, heavy with the faint grey of early morning mist. Soldiers gathered near the test site, their breath visible in the cold air as they waited for something they weren't entirely sure they believed in. The modified Sherman tank, its strange steel prongs jutting forward like the tusks of some mechanized beast, idled quietly. Today it would face a hedgerow chosen specifically for its formidable size. 12 feet tall, dense, ancient, unmoving. A perfect test. Sergeant Curtis Culin stood among the observers, trying to steady his nerves. He had spent 2 days welding, cutting, calculating, and hoping. Now the fate of his idea lay in the hands of the tank crew who had volunteered, men who trusted him enough to risk their lives. The weight of that trust pressed hard against his chest. Captain Morrison stepped up beside him. "This is it," he said. There was no need for further words. Everyone understood the stakes. The tank crew climbed inside. Corporal Jake Mitchell at the controls, Sergeant Tom Harrison at the gun, and Private Danny Chen working the loader's position. They sealed the hatches, and for a moment the only sound was the rumbling engine. Then the tank lurched forward. As the Sherman rolled toward the hedgerow, you could feel the tension across the field. Men watched with folded arms, clenched jaws, or nervous pacing. A failure could mean wasted time, destroyed equipment, or worse, proof that there was truly no solution to the hedgerow's deadly trap. But a success could break the stalemate. It could change the entire invasion. "Steady," Culin murmured, almost involuntarily, though no one inside the tank could hear him. Then came the moment. The Sherman picked up speed. Its tracks churned the earth behind it as it charged straight toward the wall of roots and stone. 30 tons of steel accelerating toward centuries-old earthworks. It was a collision no one had ever dared attempt. Soldiers winced instinctively, bracing for disaster. The impact was explosive. Dirt erupted into the air. Roots snapped with loud cracks, like the firing of rifles. The tank shuddered violently, rocking its crew inside. For a heartbeat, just a single agonizing heartbeat, it appeared stuck. The massive hedgerow absorbed the blow and refused to yield. Oh God, Culin thought. Not here, not now. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tank moved. The prongs, those crude beams cut from German beach obstacles, bit deeper into the base of the hedge. The tank pushed forward again. The engine roared, straining under the resistance, but it kept moving. Inch by inch, the Sherman forced itself through the mass. Dirt cascaded over the hull. Roots splintered, stones rolled, and slowly the tank pushed its nose through to the opposite side. Then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, the Sherman burst through the hedgerow completely, emerging into the field beyond. For a second, there was stunned silence. Then cheers erupted across the field. Soldiers who had expected failure now shouted, clapped, and pounded each other on the back. Some laughed in disbelief. Others looked on with wide, amazed eyes. Even the officers couldn't mask their relief. For the first time since D-Day, a tank had crossed a hedgerow without exposing its vulnerable belly, and it had survived. The tank crew opened their hatches, all three men grinning like they had just won a lottery. Corporal Mitchell climbed out first. "That was the smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever had," he shouted down. "We barely felt a thing, and we never lifted the hull." Captain Morrison turned to Culin, and for the first time since their conversation 2 days earlier, a smile crept across his face. "Sergeant," he said, "you might have just changed the course of this entire campaign." Every man present understood the significance. What they had witnessed wasn't just an invention, it was a solution, a breakthrough, a way to move tanks through terrain that had halted an entire army. The hedgerows, once insurmountable barriers, now looked vulnerable. Defeat now seemed something that could be turned into victory. Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters approached, his expression serious, but eyes alight with interest. "How many of these can you build?" he asked. Culin thought for a moment. "With enough welders? Maybe 10 a day." "No," Williams said, "not enough." Then his voice shifted, carrying a weight of authority. "I'm going to get you 50 welders, and all the steel you need. I want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week, and General Bradley will hear about this immediately." Culin felt a surge of disbelief. Days ago, he was simply a mechanic scribbling sketches that others dismissed as crazy. Now generals were asking how quickly he could mass-produce his invention. It was almost too much to absorb, but he also understood something else. One successful test wasn't enough. If this idea was truly going to save lives, it had to work in real combat, under fire, with no margin for error. He looked at Morrison. "Sir," he said, "we need to test this against real German positions. That's the only way to know for sure." Morrison nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." The test had succeeded, but the true trial was yet to come. The true test of any battlefield invention is not whether it works in a controlled environment, under observation, with officers taking notes at a safe distance. The real measure is whether it performs when the enemy is shooting back. When adrenaline, fear, chaos, and uncertainty collide. When lives hang in the balance and there is no room for second chances. Sergeant Curtis Culin knew this better than anyone. A single successful demonstration meant nothing if the device failed in combat. And so the next step was inevitable. The modified Sherman, now nicknamed the Rhinoceros, would be sent into a live engagement. The target would be a German strongpoint 2 miles ahead, a fortified position that had stopped every Allied advance for 3 straight days. Infantry had tried assaulting it and failed. Tanks had attempted to approach it, only to be picked off as soon as their hulls lifted over the hedgerows. Air support had limited impact due to the sheltered nature of the terrain. To the men fighting on the ground, the position felt immovable. This made it the perfect testing ground. The night before the assault, Culin inspected the modified tank one last time. He crawled beneath the hull with a lantern, checking every weld, every angle, every bolt. He ran his hands over the prongs to check for cracks or stress fractures. Everything appeared intact. but he couldn't shake the thought that tomorrow's mission was no longer theory. It was life and death. Private Danny Chen approached him quietly. "Sergeant, you should rest," he said. "We go out at dawn." Culin shook his head. "Too much to think about." "You scared?" Chen asked. Culin considered lying, but these were men who would soon trust their lives to his invention. They deserved honesty. "Terrified," he admitted. "This thing worked once, but tomorrow, if I miscalculated anything, if something breaks, people die." Chen nodded slowly. "Then I guess it's a good thing you're coming with us." That made Culin look up sharply. "With you?" Captain Morrison approached. "You're riding along, Sergeant. Technical advisor. You need to be there if something goes wrong." The idea of entering combat in the very tank he had modified struck him with equal parts dread and responsibility. If this was his invention, then he needed to see it through. By the time he climbed into the tank at dawn, settling into the commander's cupola, the worst of his fear was behind him. There was no turning back now. The morning was grey and wet, drizzle clinging to the tank's armour. Engines roared to life across the staging area. Culin's modified Sherman led a small armoured column, followed closely by infantry squads prepared to rush through any breaches the rhinoceros created. The entire assault plan hinged on Culin's creation. As they approached the first hedgerow, a known German machine gun nest waited on the other side. It had been a killing zone for days. Normally, a tank would approach cautiously, try to climb the hedge and get hit in the belly by a Panzerfaust, but not today. "Hit it at a 20-degree angle," Culin instructed over the intercom. "Let the prongs do the work." Corporal Mitchell adjusted the controls. The tank built momentum. The impact shook the crew inside, but the prongs dug in, cut through the lower roots and forced a breach. They burst through the other side before the Germans could react. The machine gun nest was still pivoting to aim when Harrison fired a single high-explosive round that silenced it instantly. "It works in combat," Chen shouted over the intercom, but there was no time to celebrate. More hedgerows, more potential ambushes, more places for death to hide. The rhinoceros pressed forward. Hedge after hedge fell before the tank. Infantry poured through behind them, cheering each successful breach. For the first time in days, the Americans were moving. Momentum, the most valuable commodity in war, was finally on their side. Then came the challenge everyone feared. "Contact front," Harrison reported. Through a narrow gap in the next hedgerow, they spotted the outline of a German Panther tank, far more powerful than a Sherman, with superior armour and a deadly long-barreled gun. The Panther's biggest weakness was its side armour, but if the rhinoceros got stuck in the hedge, it would be an easy kill. Culin made the decision instantly. "We're going through," he said. "Do not stop. We breach fast, and we hit them before they can traverse their turret." Mitchell gunned the engine. The impact was enormous. The hedgerow was thicker than any they had hit before. For a moment, the tank slowed dangerously. The prongs groaned under the pressure. Smoke billowed from the exhaust. "More power," Culin yelled. Mitchell pushed the engine to its limit. Inch by inch, the tank forced its way through. They emerged at an angle, but with the gun already pointed roughly where the Panther should be. Harrison fired immediately. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side. Smoke erupted from the German tank. Moments later, its crew bailed out, surrendering rather than fighting to the death. Infantry units swept forward, securing the position. The German strongpoint that had held out for 3 days fell in less than 2 hours. Culin climbed out of the tank, legs trembling, heart pounding. His invention had survived the fire, and it had changed the battle.